Please, take this money and run, Jonathan Whitmore whispered, his voice raw and unsteady as he pressed the heavy suitcase toward Annie. She stepped back and stared at the expensive leather case. Mr. Whitmore, are you joking? Annie kept her voice level, though her heart was beating hard. I'm a maid. I don't know what kind of game this is, but I don't take things that don't belong to me. This is not a game, Annie. Jonathan caught her by the shoulders, then seemed to realize how frightened he must look and released her. I'm begging you, take the suitcase and get out of here. Annie Carter did not move. Can you tell me what's happening? I don't have much time. I'll explain everything later. Just help me this once. For 3 months, Jonathan had treated her with more courtesy than most visitors to his estate. He greeted her each morning, thanked her when she brought coffee to the library, and never raised his voice. That did not mean she trusted him with her freedom. I appreciate the way you've treated me, she said. I'll help if I can. But a billionaire doesn't beg his maid for a favor unless something is seriously wrong. If you won't tell me what this is, I can't. Sweat shone across his forehead. This house is about to be searched. If you don't get that suitcase out now, the money inside may disappear into an investigation for months. At 2:07 the morning, Jonathan Whitmore no longer sounded like the controlled businessman Annie knew. She looked from the suitcase to the man standing before her. What does your family's property have to do with somebody like me? Her eyes narrowed. You're afraid the government will freeze your accounts, aren't you? So you found the youngest black maid in the house and decided she would make a useful sacrifice. I carry your dirty money out, and when they catch me, you say I stole it. Annie tightened her grip on the mop handle. I will not help you hide money. Jonathan stared at her, startled by the force of her answer. Then he stepped back and gave a bitter laugh. You think I'm moving assets to escape prosecution? What else am I supposed to think? The money in that suitcase is not listed among the assets under investigation. Then what is it? A bribe? A private fund nobody was supposed to find? It came from my personal safe, but it originated in the company's payroll reserve. Jonathan leaned toward her, urgency replacing his surprise. I withdrew it when I learned employees had gone unpaid. I was trying to protect it until I understood what was happening. Annie did not move. The grandfather clock beside the fireplace marked another second with a dry wooden click. You want me to believe there's more than $1 million in that case and none of it belongs to you? 1.2 million. The number settled between them. Jonathan pushed a folder across the table. Payroll records, bank receipts, names, hours, deductions, and overtime. Everything my brother tried to bury. Annie left the folder untouched. Why me? A humorless laugh escaped her. There are dozens of people in this house. You have managers, lawyers, and security guards. Why choose an 18-year-old maid? Do you think I'm foolish enough to walk into the street carrying that much cash? Because you are the only person here who has never accepted a favor from me. Jonathan released the suitcase locks. The lid opened enough to reveal rows of bundled bills. 3 months ago, you found an envelope containing $20,000 in this library. There were no cameras. You put it on my desk without opening it. When I offered you a reward, you told me I didn't have to pay you not to become a thief. Annie remembered the envelope. She also remembered wondering, for one brief second, what $20,000 could have done for her grandmother. Jonathan closed the lid. I don't trust anyone else tonight. Engines sounded beyond the front gates. Headlights swept across the library's heavy curtains. They're here, Jonathan said. Annie looked toward the driveway. Several dark vehicles were gathering outside the iron gate. Who? Federal agents. Possibly state investigators. They have warrants for the house and the corporate offices. She rested the mop against the wall. What did you do? His face changed, not with anger but with the pain of hearing the question he had been avoiding. I trusted my brother. That isn't a crime. No, but it can make one possible. Jonathan opened the folder and turned several pages toward her. Annie saw transfer dates, account numbers, and electronic signatures bearing his name. Richard used my signature, he said. He moved money through construction contracts and shipping accounts. Some of the companies exist only as mailing addresses. Others are legitimate businesses he used without their knowledge. And you didn't notice? No. The answer came without an excuse. How does a man lose millions of dollars without noticing? By believing reports instead of people. Her eyes dropped to the page. Near the top was a name she recognized. Maria Delgado. 6 weeks of unpaid wages. Health insurance deducted from her checks, but never submitted. Annie's jaw tightened. 2 days earlier, she had found Maria crying in the laundry room. Maria claimed onions from the kitchen had irritated her eyes. Although there had been no onions nearby, Jonathan followed Annie's gaze. That is why I need you to take the suitcase to David Cole, a labor attorney in Greensboro. He can count the money in front of witnesses and place it in a trust for the workers. Why cash? Richard has people inside accounting. Every electronic payment I approved was reversed within hours. I was trying to protect the payroll until I knew who I could trust. And now you want me to carry it away 5 minutes before federal agents arrive. Yes, it sounds exactly like hiding money. I know. If they stop me with that suitcase, will you tell them you gave it to me? I'll tell them before they ask. Whether they believe me is another matter. At least he did not lie about that. You'll stay here with your lawyers, Annie said. I'll be stopped in a truck with $1.2 million. You'll still be Jonathan Whitmore. I'll be the black maid who stole it. Jonathan closed his eyes for a second. Yes, that is the story they will tell. His honesty angered her more than a denial would have. I have no one else, he said. Everyone around me has already taken something. The headlights reached the gate. A security guard stepped out of the booth and lifted a phone to his ear. Jonathan placed a set of keys beside the folder. The old Ford Ranger near the greenhouse belongs to Mr. Bell, the groundskeeper. It won't appear on the company vehicle list. Cole's address is in the folder. Why not call him? My security director reports to Richard. I don't know which phones are safe, which lawyers are safe, or how much of this house belongs to my brother now. Annie looked toward the hallway. The mansion had never seemed so quiet. Every closed door felt as though someone stood behind it listening. Jonathan pushed the suitcase closer. A paycheck isn't charity, Mr. Whitmore, Annie said. It's a debt with a due date. I know that now. No, you learned it tonight. Maria learned it 6 weeks ago. He accepted the correction without defending himself. A buzzer sounded at the front of the house. Jonathan turned toward it. Annie stared at the suitcase. She thought of Maria's overdue rent. Mr. Bell buying insulin for his wife and the warehouse employees whose names she had copied into her blue notebook because no one in payroll would return their calls. The suitcase remained between them. Annie still had not touched the handle. The alarm sounded again, longer this time. Jonathan glanced toward the hallway, but Annie kept her eyes on the suitcase. What happens if I say no? I stay here. The agent sees the money, and the workers wait until a court decides whether it belongs to them or the company. How long? Months. Maybe longer. It is the unpaid wages of 47 employees. Annie hesitated. You could be lying about all of this. Yes. The answer made her look up. You should assume I might be, Jonathan continued. Check the receipts. Call the bank numbers printed on them. Give the money to no one until David Cole verifies every document. You expect me to trust a lawyer you chose? No. I expect you to question him too. Footsteps moved quickly through the hall outside the library, then stopped. Jonathan lowered his voice. Calvin may already know the agents are here. Your security director? On paper, he reports to me. I no longer know who he actually serves. Annie looked toward the closed doors. The silence beyond them no longer felt empty. Then why are we still standing here with the money? Because you have not agreed. You could order me. Jonathan's expression hardened, though not with anger at her. No. I could fire you. I could frighten you. I could use the fact that you need this job. None of that would make your choice voluntary. The words slowed her anger without removing it. The library door opened. Evelyn Brooks entered and closed it behind her. They're at the front gate, she said. Calvin told security not to open it until he receives authorization. Jonathan checked his watch. That gives us about 2 minutes. Mrs. Brooks looked at Annie. He told you? He told me enough to make me wonder whether he has lost his mind. That possibility is still under consideration. Jonathan ignored her. Annie pointed at the suitcase. He wants me to carry $1.2 million out of this house. Mrs. Brooks did not look surprised. You knew? I knew employees were missing wages. I knew Mr. Whitmore withdrew the payroll reserve. I did not know he intended to place it in your hands. Would you take it? Mrs. Brooks considered the question. No. Jonathan's face tightened. I am 67 years old, she continued. Calvin knows my car, my schedule, and every relative I still visit. I would not reach the end of the driveway. She turned to Annie. That does not mean you should take it. Then what are you telling me? Maria received an eviction notice yesterday. Earl Bell cut his wife's insulin dose in half. 3 men at the Gastonia warehouse are buying groceries on credit from the same church pantry. That money is not Mr. Whitmore's escape. It is their labor coming back to them. Annie looked at Jonathan. Why didn't you pay them sooner? I believed Richard when he said it was a software failure. You believed your brother over 47 people. Yes. The admission came without a defense. Mrs. Brooks stepped closer to Annie. You are not responsible for saving this family from its own mistakes. Remember that. But if you choose to carry that suitcase, carry it for the names in the folder, not for the man standing beside it. They won't remain patient much longer, Jonathan said. Calvin will use his master key to enter this room in less than 2 minutes. If you don't leave now, there will be no second chance. Annie studied the leather case, then looked directly at him. You're putting yourself in prison, Mr. Whitmore. If I walk out with this and get caught, what will you tell federal agents? That you accidentally handed more than $1 million to the Maid? I'll tell them the truth. I gave it to you to repay a debt this company created. Whether they believe me depends on whether you reach David Cole before everything is frozen. Annie gave a dry laugh. How noble. Do you think a black maid carrying a suitcase of cash gets to explain herself before she's thrown to the ground and charged with theft? People will believe the worst before I open my mouth. I know. Jonathan gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned pale. That is why you will take Mr. Bell's old Ford Ranger and stay off the main highways. David Cole is waiting in Greensboro. He is the only labor attorney Richard has not bought. Sirens rose outside, breaking the stillness of the estate. Red and blue light swept across the library walls. They've opened the main gate. Calvin's voice called from the hallway. Search every room. No one leaves the property. Annie turned toward the half-closed door. Her heart pounded. If she remained beside the suitcase, she would become the perfect sacrifice in a war between wealthy brothers. If you were in Annie's position, knowing that one decision could save 47 workers but destroy your own future, what would you do? If you feel for Annie, please like this video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because you never know, someone near you may be watching Annie's story at this very moment. Annie, Jonathan said, his voice lower now, that notebook in your pocket isn't filled with meaningless numbers. You wrote those names down because you wanted somebody to remember them. Do you want justice? Or do you want to stay silent because that is what people expect from you? She stared at him. Do not use my conscience to corner me. You're right, he said immediately. That was unfair. His apology unsettled her more than the pressure had. She looked at Mrs. Brooks. The older woman gave no instruction. This choice must be yours. Annie lowered her gaze to the suitcase. The money inside could keep families in their homes. It could also end her future before it had begun. If they catch me, you will be the first person held responsible. Do you understand? I accept that. Annie reached for the handle. The weight pulled against her shoulder before the case had risen more than a few inches. Jonathan stepped forward to help, but one look from her stopped him. He placed a set of keys in her free hand. Take the service stairs to the basement. The greenhouse door opens from inside. The Ford has half a tank. Only half? Mr. Bell never lets it fall below that. The pounding at the front of the house stopped. The sudden silence frightened Annie more than the noise. The intercom clicked. Mr. Whitmore, Calvin said, calm and controlled. Federal agents are requesting entry. I'm coming to the library. Jonathan turned toward the door. Go. Mrs. Brooks opened a narrow panel hidden beside the bookshelves. Annie followed her into the service corridor, carrying the suitcase with both hands. They moved down the back stairs. The case struck Annie's knee at every turn while Mrs. Brooks switched off the lights behind them. At the basement door, Annie stopped. What if they arrest him? They might. What if they arrest me? That may happen too. Mrs. Brooks placed one firm hand against Annie's cheek. Courage is not believing nothing bad will happen. It is deciding what must be done before fear decides for you. She opened the door. Cold December air entered from the greenhouse yard. Mr. Bell's old Ford Ranger waited beneath a security light. Its paint faded, and one side mirror held in place with black tape. Annie placed the suitcase behind the passenger seat, climbed into the cab, and turned the key. The engine coughed twice before starting. At the front of the estate, the iron gates were opening. Annie shifted into gear and drove through the service exit. She kept the headlights off until the truck reached the road. Only then did she check the rearview mirror. Whitmore House disappeared behind the trees. For the first time that night, Annie understood that carrying the money would be the easy part. Annie drove without turning on the radio. The old Ford Ranger rattled every time it crossed a crack in the road, and the sound reminded her that this was not a dream. The suitcase behind her seat was real. The money inside was real. The danger following her was real. Her hands remained tight around the steering wheel. She had driven this road many times before, but never at 2:30 in the morning with more than $1 million sitting behind her. At the first intersection outside the Whitmore property, she stopped and looked in the rearview mirror. No headlights, no police cars, no black SUVs. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Then her phone vibrated. Annie almost dropped it. The screen showed an unknown number. She ignored it. A few seconds later, it vibrated again. This time there was a message. Annie Carter, do not stop. Do not answer calls. Continue to the old textile warehouse on Pine Street. You are being followed. Her eyes narrowed. She immediately reached for the phone again, but stopped. It could be Jonathan. It could be someone else. That was the problem. She had spent the last hour learning that trust was something people with power could buy, fake or destroy. She placed the phone on the passenger seat and continued driving. The address Jonathan gave her was not the one in the message. David Cole's law office was in Greensboro. The warehouse was in the opposite direction. Someone wanted her to change course. The question was who. 20 minutes later, she reached a gas station that was still open. The fluorescent lights above the pumps flickered, making the empty parking lot look colder than it was. Annie pulled in but did not turn off the engine. She picked up the folder from the passenger seat. Inside were payroll records, bank documents, and the names of 47 employees. She turned through the pages until she found the note Jonathan had mentioned. David Cole, Greensboro, labor attorney. A handwritten number. She stared at it. Then she remembered something Mrs. Brooks had said. Carry it for the names in the folder, not for the man standing beside it. Annie picked up her phone and called the number. It rang twice. A man answered. David Cole. Annie said nothing. Who is this? My name is Annie Carter. There was a pause. Where did you get this number? Jonathan Whitmore. The silence lasted longer this time. Are you at the Whitmore estate? No. Is the money with you? Annie looked at the suitcase in the mirror. Yes. David exhaled slowly. Then you need to listen carefully. Do not come to my office. Her grip tightened around the phone. Why? Because someone has been watching my office since midnight. The words confirmed her worst fear. Are you saying Jonathan was right? I'm saying Richard Whitmore is not the only person involved. Annie looked around the gas station parking lot. What do I do? Drive north. There is a diner off Route 85 called Maple Grove Family Restaurant. It opens early for truck drivers. Park near the front entrance. Do not go inside until I arrive. How do I know you're really David Cole? You don't. That answer surprised her. Then why should I trust you? You shouldn't. The honesty sounded familiar. Mr. Cole, Miss Carter, right now you have a suitcase full of money, a company investigation happening behind you, and people who would rather recover that cash than answer questions about where it came from. Trust is a luxury you don't have tonight. Annie looked at the clock on the dashboard. Duan Libya Lapendaten, MM. Are the workers really owed this money? David paused. Yes. 47 people? Yes. Maria Delgado? Another pause. You know Maria? She works at the Whitmore estate. Then you know more than most investigators will when they arrive. Annie looked down at the folder. She had written Maria's name herself after seeing the unpaid wages. Why didn't anyone speak up? Some did. They were ignored. Some were afraid. Some thought losing one paycheck was temporary. And Jonathan? David's voice softened slightly. Jonathan made mistakes. Serious ones. But the payroll money he gave you is not stolen money. Annie looked out at the empty road. She still did not know if Jonathan Whitmore was a good man who failed, or a rich man trying to repair damage after getting caught. Maybe both could be true. She started the truck again. Maple Grove Family Restaurant? Yes. And if someone else is waiting there? Leave. That's your plan? That's survival. The call ended. Annie placed the phone down and pulled back onto the road. 20 minutes later, she saw the sign. Maple Grove Family Restaurant. The parking lot was almost empty except for two 18-wheelers and an old pickup truck. She parked near the entrance, exactly as David instructed. She did not get out. The suitcase remained beside her. The minutes passed slowly. At 3:31 a.m., another vehicle entered the parking lot. A black sedan. Annie's hand moved toward the keys. The sedan stopped several spaces away. The driver did not get out. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She watched the sedan through the windshield. The phone continued ringing. Finally she answered. "Annie," a man's voice said. Her stomach tightened. She recognized it. Calvin Ross. "Where is the suitcase?" he asked. Annie said nothing. "You should understand something," Calvin continued. "Jonathan Whitmore is desperate. Desperate men make promises they cannot keep. How did you get my number?" A short pause. "You are asking the wrong question. What's the right one? Whether you want to spend the next 20 years believing you helped people, or whether you want to understand that you were used." Annie looked at the black sedan. "Who told you where I was?" Calvin did not answer. That was answer enough. Annie ended the call. She started the engine. The black sedan turned on its headlights. At that moment, Annie understood one thing clearly. The money was never the only thing they were chasing. They were chasing whoever was brave enough to carry it. Annie pressed the accelerator before she had fully decided where she was going. The black sedan behind her followed. She did not panic. Panic made people predictable, and predictable people were easy to catch. She drove past the restaurant entrance instead of leaving immediately, circled around the back parking lot and turned onto a smaller service road behind the building. The Ford Ranger struggled as she pushed it harder, but the old truck responded. Her phone rang again. She ignored it. A minute later, a message appeared. "Stop running. You don't understand what you're carrying." Annie looked at the screen briefly, then placed the phone face down. That was exactly the kind of sentence powerful people used when they wanted someone else to feel powerless. She had spent enough time in wealthy houses to recognize the pattern. They did not always threaten you directly. Sometimes they simply reminded you that the world was built to believe them before it believed you. The road narrowed as she left the highway and entered an industrial area filled with closed warehouses and empty loading docks. She slowed near a dark building with faded lettering on the side. "Whitmore Logistics." Annie stopped. Her first instinct was to keep driving. Then she noticed something. The building was supposed to be closed, but one light was on near the side entrance. She checked the rearview mirror. No sedan, no headlights. She grabbed the folder from the passenger seat and stepped out. She did not take the suitcase. Not yet. The cold air hit her face as she walked toward the entrance. She kept one hand inside her coat pocket, holding her phone. The door opened before she reached it. A woman stood there, late 40s, brown coat, short hair, tired eyes. "Annie Carter?" Annie stopped. "Who are you?" "Rachel Morgan." The name meant nothing. "That doesn't answer my question." Rachel looked behind Annie toward the empty parking lot. "You're right. Come inside first. Ask questions where someone can't hear us." That sounds like something someone says before trapping me. Rachel almost smiled. "Good. Keep thinking like that." Annie did not move. Rachel lowered her voice. "I worked in Whitmore Industries accounting for 9 years. Annie's expression changed slightly. "Then you worked with Richard?" "Yes." "And you knew?" "I knew something was wrong." The answer bothered Annie. "Something?" Rachel looked away. That's what people say when they don't want to admit they ignored something. The honesty made Annie listen. "Come inside." After a moment, Annie followed. The warehouse office was small and outdated. A desk sat beneath a window covered with old blinds. There were stacks of documents everywhere. But unlike Jonathan's library, this room looked like people actually worked there. Rachel noticed Annie looking around. This was the old payroll office before Richard moved everything downtown. "Why are you here?" "Because I was fired 3 weeks ago." "Why?" "Because I asked questions." Rachel opened a drawer and removed a flash drive. He was moving money through fake vendors. I found invoices that didn't match contracts. I reported it. "To Jonathan?" "Yes." Annie studied hair. "And what did he do?" Rachel's silence lasted too long. "He asked me for proof." "And?" "I gave it to him." "Then why are you fired?" "Because by the time he understood how deep it went, Richard had already removed people who could expose him." Annie looked down at the flash drive. "Why should I believe you?" "You shouldn't." Again, the answer surprised her. "Everyone keeps saying that." "Because it's true. You should verify everything." Rachel pointed toward the folder. But if you open those records, you'll find the same names I found. Annie did not open the folder. What do you want from me? Nothing. That's not believable. Rachel sighed. I want the workers to get paid. I want people to stop pretending this was just a business mistake. And I want Richard Whitmore to stop hiding behind his brother's reputation. Annie looked at her carefully. Did Jonathan know about the fake companies? Rachel hesitated. I don't know. That answer felt more honest than certainty. He should have known, Rachel continued. A man who owns a company that size should know where money goes. Annie nodded slowly. That's what I thought. For the first time since leaving the mansion, she felt the weight of the situation differently. Jonathan was not the only person who had failed. There were dozens of people who saw pieces of the truth and waited for someone else to put them together. Her phone vibrated. This time, the message was from David Cole. Do not go to the restaurant. Someone followed you. I am changing locations. Send me your current position only if you are safe. Annie showed Rachel the message. Rachel read it and immediately looked concerned. David knows about the warehouse? No. Then don't send him anything yet. Why? Because if Richard has someone watching him, they could track your message. Annie looked at her phone. Everyone had advice. Everyone had warnings. Everyone said they were trying to help. She hated that she had no way to know who was telling the truth. Outside, a vehicle slowed near the warehouse. Both women heard it. Rachel turned off the office light. How many exits? Annie whispered. Tfo. Which one is safer? Rachel looked at her. You're asking the right question now. The vehicle stopped outside. A door opened. Footsteps approached. Annie looked toward the suitcase sitting inside the truck. For the first time, she realized something. The money was not only a burden, it was evidence. And everyone who wanted it gone had a reason. The footsteps outside stopped. Annie stood still beside the desk, listening. The warehouse was old enough that every sound traveled through the walls. The hum of the lights, the wind pushing against the metal siding, the quiet movement of whoever had just entered the building. Rachel moved toward the second door at the back of the office. Stay behind me. Annie shook her head. No. Rachel looked back. No. I'm already carrying the money everyone wants. Hiding behind you won't make me safer. For a second, Rachel studied her. Then she nodded. Fair enough. The handle on the main office door slowly turned. Rachel reached for a metal file holder on the desk. It was not much of a weapon, but it was the closest thing within reach. The door opened. A man stepped inside. Not Calvin. Not Richard. Annie recognized him after a moment. Mr. Bell? The older man stopped. Earl Bell looked exactly as he always had at Whitmore House. Gray work jacket, worn boots, rough hands from years of maintaining the estate grounds. But tonight he looked exhausted. You scared me half to death, he said quietly. Annie lowered her guard slightly. Mr. Bell, what are you doing here? He looked at Rachel, then at Annie. Mrs. Brooks called me. Mrs. Brooks? She said if you got this far, you might need someone who knows how to keep an old truck running and doesn't ask too many questions. Annie exhaled. She knew? She knew enough. Earl looked toward the window. You need to leave soon. Rachel stepped forward. Are you sure nobody followed you? I took 3 different roads. Calvin has people watching the estate, Annie said. Earl nodded. That's why I didn't come from there. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. David Cole's new location. Annie did not take it immediately. How do I know this is real? Earl looked at her for a moment. You don't. The answer was becoming familiar. You're all very comfortable telling me not to trust anyone. Because that's the only thing keeping you alive tonight. He handed her the paper. The address was a small church outside the city. Annie looked up. A church? David's meeting people there. Why? Because nobody expects a labor attorney to hide evidence in a place where people go to pray. Rachel gave a small nod. It makes sense. Annie folded the paper. Then she noticed Earl looking at the folder in her hand. You knew about the unpaid wages. His expression changed. I knew something was wrong. That's what everyone says. Earl accepted the criticism. Because it's true. Annie looked away. 47 people were waiting for someone to admit what was happening. I know. Did you tell Jonathan? Earl hesitated. I told him Richard was changing things. I told him employees were worried. And? He said he would look into it. Annie's voice became quieter. And you believed him? Earl looked down. Yes. The admission carried weight because it came from someone who had nothing to gain. My father worked as a groundskeeper, Earl said. I spent 40 years taking care of that property. I watched 3 generations of Whitmores walk through those doors. I wanted to believe Jonathan was different. Is he? Earl looked at the suitcase. I don't know. The honesty surprised her. But tonight, he continued, he gave up the safest thing he had, his reputation, his money, his family name. He gave that case to someone everyone else in that house would have overlooked. Annie did not answer. A sound came from outside. A car door closing. Rachel moved toward the window and looked through the blinds. We have a problem. Everyone became silent. What? Black SUV. No markings. Earl walked to the side window. Not police. Annie felt her stomach tighten. How long? Not long. Rachel grabbed the flash drive. We need to move. Annie picked up the suitcase. This time the weight felt different. Not heavier. More dangerous. They moved through the back exit into the cold night air. The warehouse yard was empty except for old shipping containers and abandoned equipment. Earl led them toward a narrow path between buildings. Your truck is on the other side, he whispered. Annie followed, but stopped when she heard voices. 2 men were approaching from the opposite direction. They were not close enough to see clearly, but they were searching. Rachel pulled Annie behind a stack of wooden pallets. The suitcase rested between them. Annie could hear her own breathing. One of the men spoke. She can't be far. Another voice answered. Find the truck. Annie looked at Earl. They know about the Ford. Earl's face hardened. Then someone at Whitmore House gave them information. Rachel looked at Annie. Calvin, or someone else. The voices moved closer. Annie tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. For the first time that night, she understood something important. The people chasing her did not care whether the money was stolen. They only cared that it reached the people who were supposed to receive it. A phone vibrated. Everyone froze. It was Annie's. She looked at the screen. David Cole. She almost rejected the call. Then she answered. Annie, David whispered. Where are you? She did not respond immediately. Outside the warehouse, footsteps continued moving closer. David, she whispered back. How did you know where to find me? A pause. Then his answer came. Because someone just tried to kill the power at the church where we were supposed to meet. Annie looked at Rachel. The situation had just changed again. David lowered his voice. Whoever is behind this is not trying to recover money anymore. What are they trying to do? The line went silent for a second. Then David said, they're trying to make sure nobody ever sees the evidence. The call ended. Annie looked at the suitcase. Then, at the people hiding beside her. The money was no longer just a debt. It was the only thing that could prove the truth. The footsteps outside moved closer. Annie held her breath while the 4 of them remained hidden behind the stack of wooden pallets. The cold air cut through her thin jacket. But she barely noticed. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. A shoe scraped against the concrete. Someone was only a few yards away. Earl leaned toward her and whispered, when I move, you run. Annie looked at him. No. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That wasn't a suggestion. And I'm not leaving you here. Annie, you already spent 40 years protecting that house. I'm not letting you stand between me and people who want this money. Earl stared at her for a moment, then gave a quiet sigh. You remind me of Mrs. Brooks. I'll take that as a compliment. It was. Rachel looked around the corner. They're splitting up. How many? Annie asked. 3 that I can see. Earl nodded toward the far side of the warehouse. There's an old loading road behind the containers. It leads to the highway. And the truck? Near the maintenance shed. Annie tightened her grip on the suitcase. The plan was simple, which meant it would probably fail. A flashlight beam moved across the ground. Rachel suddenly grabbed a loose piece of metal from the floor and threw it toward the opposite side of the yard. The sound echoed. One of the men immediately turned. There. The footsteps moved away from them. Now, Earl whispered. They moved quickly. Annie followed Earl through the narrow space between containers while Rachel stayed behind them, watching their path. The old Ford Ranger waited near the maintenance shed. Annie reached for the door handle. A voice called from behind them. Stop. Everyone froze. A man stood near the warehouse entrance. He wore a dark jacket and held a flashlight, but he was not a police officer. Annie recognized him. Calvin Ross, Jonathan's security director, the man who had ordered the Whitmore gates closed. Annie, Calvin said calmly, you're making a mistake. She did not answer. Calvin slowly stepped forward. You think you're helping those workers. You think Jonathan is some kind of hero because he finally decided to do the right thing. You followed me. I followed the money. Same thing. His expression changed slightly. You don't understand what you're involved in. That's what everyone keeps telling me. Because everyone is trying to keep you alive. Annie almost laughed. By chasing me through warehouses? Calvin looked at Earl. You brought her here? Earl stepped in front of Annie. Don't. Calvin shook his head. You have no idea what Jonathan has done. Annie noticed something. Calvin was not looking at the suitcase. He was looking at her. You don't want the money, she said. The silence that followed answered her. You want what's inside the folder. Calvin's face hardened. Give me the evidence, and you walk away. Rachel stepped beside Annie. That's not how this works. Calvin looked at her. You should have stayed quiet, Rachel. Annie turned. You know her? Everyone who worked against Richard became a problem. The words came out too easily. Calvin realized his mistake a second too late. Annie remembered every detail, every name, every sentence. She reached into her pocket and turned on her phone recorder. Calvin noticed. His eyes dropped. You really are careful. My grandmother taught me to write things down. Your grandmother sounds like a smart woman. She is. For the first time, Calvin looked less confident. A siren sounded in the distance. Not close, but close enough. Calvin looked toward the road. You called the police? No. Annie looked at Rachel. Rachel shook her head. Then Earl pointed behind Calvin. A vehicle was approaching. Not a police car. A dark sedan. Calvin's expression changed. He stepped back. Who else is here? Nobody answered. The sedan stopped near the entrance. The door opened. A man stepped out. Richard Whitmore. Annie had only seen photographs of him before. The younger brother who sat on magazine covers beside Jonathan, smiling beside words like innovation and success. In person, he looked different. Not powerful. Cornered. Calvin, Richard said. You were supposed to handle this quietly. Calvin turned. You told me nobody else was involved. I told you to recover the money. You didn't tell me your brother had a witness. Richard's eyes moved to Annie. For the first time, she saw fear in his face. Not anger. Fear. Because she was not carrying money anymore. She was carrying proof. Richard took a step forward. Annie, I'm sure you've been told many things tonight. Enough to know people keep underestimating me. I'm offering you a chance to walk away. Like Calvin offered? Richard's expression changed. How much did he tell you? Enough. The old warehouse fell silent. Then Annie lifted the suitcase slightly. 47 people are waiting for this money. Richard looked at the case. No. His voice was quiet. They're waiting for a story. Annie stared at him. What does that mean? Richard looked at Calvin, then back at her. It means your brother's plan was never to save those employees. Earl stepped forward. Careful, Richard. But Richard continued. Jonathan needs someone to believe he's the good brother. He needs someone to carry the blame if everything collapses. Annie felt a cold feeling settle in her chest, because for the first time that night, she wondered if she had been asking the wrong question. Not, who is lying, but who benefits if I believe them? A police siren grew louder. Richard looked toward the road. You have about 30 seconds to decide who you trust. Then he got back into the sedan. The car sped away before anyone could stop him. Annie stood frozen. Rachel looked at her. Do you believe him? Annie looked down at the suitcase. I don't know, and that frightened her more than anything else, because until that moment, she had believed the truth was somewhere waiting to be found. Now she understood something worse. The truth was there, but everyone was fighting to control who got to tell it. The sound of Richard Whitmore's car disappeared into the distance. For several seconds, nobody moved. The sirens grew louder, but they were still far enough away that Annie could hear her own breathing. Rachel was the first to speak. That was not supposed to happen. Annie looked at her. What wasn't? Richard showing up. You knew he might? Rachel shook her head. No, but I knew he was afraid. Earl looked toward the road where the sedan had vanished. Fear makes people careless. Annie looked down at the suitcase. And tonight, everyone suddenly wants me to believe they're the only person telling the truth. Nobody answered, because nobody could. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted them. This time, the lights were different. Blue and white flashed across the warehouse walls. Earl stepped closer. Federal agents? No, Rachel said after looking outside. She narrowed her eyes. Local police. Annie's stomach tightened. Is that good or bad? Rachel gave a tired smile. At this point, I'm not sure there's a difference. The warehouse doors opened. 3 officers entered with flashlights raised. They immediately stopped when they saw Annie holding the suitcase. The first officer looked from her to the others. "Ma'am, put the bag down slowly." Annie did not move. "I'm not running." "Then put it down." Before she could answer, a familiar voice came from behind the officers. "Officer, she is not a suspect." David Cole walked into the warehouse. "Anya Starret. You said you were at the church." "I was." "Then how did you get here?" David looked at Rachel. "Because Rachel called me." Annie looked at Rachel. "You called him?" "Yes." "When?" "When you were talking to Calvin." Annie frowned. "You had no phone." Rachel held up a small device. "Old work phone. I kept it after I was fired." David approached slowly. "Annie, are you hurt?" "No." "Did anyone force you to take the money?" She almost laughed. "That is the question everyone asks. Because it matters." She looked at him carefully. "Does it?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if you were forced, the entire case changes." Annie glanced at the officers, then back at David. "I chose to take it." The officer wrote something down. "Why?" Annie looked at the suitcase. "Because 47 people worked for a company that used their labor while refusing to pay them." The officer paused. David nodded slightly. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." Annie noticed. "You were testing me." "No." "Yes, you were." David sighed. "I needed to know whether you understood what you were carrying." "I understand enough." "No," David said quietly. "You understand the money. You don't understand the danger." The words made her uncomfortable. "Then explain it." David looked around the warehouse. "Not here." They moved to a small office away from the main floor. The officers stayed outside while David closed the door. Annie placed the suitcase on the desk. David did not touch it. Instead, he opened the folder. Jonathan was telling the truth about the unpaid wages. Annie watched his face. "But?" "There is always a but." "Go on." David removed several pages. "Richard created fake vendors and moved company money through them." "That part is clear." "But the reason he needed access to the payroll reserve was because someone else was pressuring him." "Who?" "I don't know yet." Annie crossed her arms. "So Richard wasn't the top?" "Maybe not." "That's convenient." David looked at her. "You think I'm lying too?" "I think everyone in this room has known more than they told me." That was difficult to argue with. David nodded. "You're right." The answer surprised her. "I should have explained more." "Why didn't you?" "Because I assumed you were only the person carrying the money." "And now?" "Now I think you may be the person who noticed what everyone else ignored." Annie looked away. She remembered the names she wrote down. The unpaid hours. The conversations people thought she did not hear. "I'm not special." "No," David said. "You're observant." Outside the office, one of the officers knocked. "Mr. Cole, we need to move. The federal team will arrive soon." David gathered the documents. "Annie, we need to get this suitcase into legal custody before federal investigators arrive." She did not release it. "Whose custody?" "A protected evidence account." "Controlled by who?" "A court-appointed trustee." "Who chooses that trustee?" David paused. Annie noticed. That pause told her everything. "You don't know." "I have a list of options." "That is not the same thing." David looked at her for a moment. "You're right." Again, no argument. She was beginning to understand something about honest people. They did not rush to fill silence. They let the truth sit there. The warehouse door opened. A woman in a dark coat entered with 2 federal agents behind her. "David Cole?" "Yes." She showed her badge. "Special Agent Lauren Mitchell. We need to discuss the Whitmore investigation." Her eyes moved to Annie, then to the suitcase. "Is that the payroll reserve?" Annie felt every person in the room become still. "Yes," David answered. Agent Mitchell looked at Annie. "Miss Carter, I need you to understand something. A lot of people are going to tell you they are protecting you." She stepped closer. "Some of them may be." Annie waited. "And some may be protecting themselves." For the first time that night, Annie felt like someone had finally said the thing she had been thinking. Agent Mitchell looked at the suitcase. "We need to know one thing." "What?" "Who told you to take it?" Annie looked down. The answer seemed simple. Jonathan Whitmore. But after everything that happened, simple answers felt dangerous. She thought about Jonathan's fear, Richard's warning, Calvin's threats, Mrs. Brooks's advice. Then she answered carefully, "Jonathan Whitmore gave me the suitcase." Agent Mitchell nodded. "And why did he choose you?" Annie looked at the folder filled with names. Because I was the only person in that house who had nothing to lose by telling the truth. Nobody spoke. Outside, more vehicles arrived, and Annie realized the next battle would not be about carrying the money anymore. It would be about proving why she carried it. Agent Lauren Mitchell watched Annie carefully for several seconds after her answer. Because you were the only person in that house who had nothing to lose by telling the truth. The words remained in the room, not because they were dramatic, because everyone understood what they meant. Agent Mitchell looked at David. Mr. Cole, I need the documents in the suitcase transferred into federal custody until we establish the proper chain of evidence. Annie's hand tightened around the folder. Federal custody means what exactly? The agent looked at her. It means the money will be secured. That wasn't my question. A few people in the room exchanged looks. Agent Mitchell did not appear offended. It means the funds will not be released until the investigation determines ownership and legal responsibility. So the workers still wait. That depends on the investigation. Annie nodded slowly. So the people who were already waiting continue waiting. David stepped forward. Agent Mitchell, the money is documented payroll reserve. The employees have records proving those wages are owed. And I understand that, Mr. Cole. But my job is not to decide who deserves sympathy. My job is to protect evidence. Annie looked at the suitcase. That money isn't evidence to them. Agent Mitchell looked back. Explain. It's rent, medicine, groceries. It's people's lives. The agent's expression softened slightly. I believe you understand what it represents, Miss Carter. But emotions cannot determine a federal investigation. Annie nodded. That's exactly why people like Maria wait 6 weeks before anyone notices. The room became quiet. David looked at Annie, surprised. Agent Mitchell studied her. Who is Maria? An employee who worked for Whitmore Industries. Her insurance was deducted from her paycheck, but the company never paid the provider. Agent Mitchell immediately looked at David. Do you have records of that? Yes. Then I need them. Rachel stepped forward. I have more. Everyone turned toward her. She reached into her coat and pulled out the flash drive. I kept copies before Richard removed me from accounting. Agent Mitchell took a step closer. Why didn't you report this? Rachel laughed quietly, without humor. I did. To whom? The company. And? They asked me to wait. Annie looked at her. How long? Long enough to realize waiting was the point. Agent Mitchell accepted the flash drive. Thank you. Rachel looked surprised. That's it? What did you expect? I don't know. That is usually the problem, Agent Mitchell said. People expect justice to arrive loudly. Most of the time, it begins with someone saving a file they were told to delete. The sentence stayed with Annie, because that was what she had done too. She had written names in a notebook because she did not want people to disappear. A few minutes later, federal agents began photographing documents and securing the suitcase. Annie watched every movement. The money that had felt impossible to touch now disappeared behind evidence tags and official paperwork. She felt relief. Then she felt uneasy. David noticed. You don't trust the process. I don't know the process. That's fair. You keep saying things like that. Because they're true. Annie looked at him. You admit when people are right. E3. That's rare. David smiled faintly. My father used to say a person's character shows when admitting they're wrong costs them something. What did your father do? He was a mechanic. Annie looked surprised. Not a lawyer? No. Then why labor law? David looked toward the agents working around the suitcase. Because I watched people spend their entire lives building things they couldn't afford to enjoy. When he got sick, his employer found a reason not to cover his medical expenses. Annie became quiet. And you decided that was wrong. I decided someone should say it out loud. Before Annie could respond, Agent Mitchell approached. Miss Carter. Annie turned. We need your statement. My statement? Yes. Everything from the moment Mr. Whitmore gave you the suitcase until now. How long will that take? Possibly several hours. Annie glanced toward the windows. The sky was beginning to change. The darkness outside was fading into early morning gray. She had not slept. She had not eaten. But she nodded. Okay. The interview began in a small office near the loading area. Agent Mitchell asked careful questions. Not accusing questions. Not friendly questions. Just questions. When did you first meet Jonathan Whitmore? How long had you worked at the estate? Why do you believe he trusted you? Annie answered honestly. Then came the question she expected. Did Mr. Whitmore ever offer you money before tonight? Annie paused. Yes. When? 3 months ago. For what reason? He offered me a reward after I returned an envelope I found. How much? $20,000. Agent Mitchell looked up. And you refused? Yes. Why? Annie remembered that night, the envelope sitting on Jonathan's desk, the temptation, the choice, because I didn't want him to think honesty had a price. Agent Mitchell wrote something down. Miss Carter, do you understand that detail may become important? Why? Because if investigators believe you were motivated by money, they may question your actions. Annie looked through the glass wall toward the agents handling the evidence. Then I hope they also look at why the money mattered. Agent Mitchell closed her notebook. They will. A moment passed. Then she added quietly, but you should prepare yourself. The hardest part of a case like this is not finding the truth. Annie looked at her. What is it? Convincing people who benefited from the lie to accept it. Outside the office, a phone rang. One of the agents answered, then immediately walked toward Agent Mitchell. His expression changed. Agent Mitchell, we have a problem. She stood. What happened? The agent lowered his voice. Someone leaked the story. David looked up. What story? The agent turned on a tablet. A news headline filled the screen. Billionaire heir accused of financial fraud Maid flees with millions in cash. Annie stared at the words. Her name was not mentioned. Not yet. But she knew what would happen next. The story had already been written, and she was about to become the person everyone blamed for reading it. The headline remained on the screen. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Annie read it again. Billionaire heir accused of financial fraud Maid flees with millions in cash. Not employee. Not witness. Not someone who had been asked to help. Maid. The word carried more weight than the rest of the sentence. Agent Mitchell took the tablet from the agent's hand. Who published this? Local news first, then several financial sites copied it. How did they get the information? The agent shook his head. We're checking. David stepped closer. They knew about the suitcase before we arrived. Rachel crossed her arms. Someone wanted the story out before the evidence could be reviewed. Annie looked at them, so they decided what people would believe before anyone checked the facts. Nobody disagreed. Agent Mitchell turned back to the screen. The headline doesn't say Jonathan Whitmore gave you the money. No, Annie said quietly. It says you fled with it. A familiar anger rose inside her. Not because she was surprised, because she had expected it. She had spent her whole life watching people decide who someone was before learning their name. The only difference was tonight, the entire country might be watching. Her phone began ringing. Unknown numbers. One after another. Agent Mitchell noticed. Do not answer those. I wasn't planning to. Good. David looked concerned. This is moving faster than I expected. Why? Annie asked. Because whoever released this does not want a legal process. They want public opinion. Rachel looked at the headline. Public opinion moves faster than evidence. Annie looked at her, and once people decide the story, they stop listening. Rachel nodded. That is usually how it works. Agent Mitchell closed the tablet. Miss Carter, you need protection until we understand who leaked this. Annie looked surprised. Protection? Yes. Because people think I stole money? Because someone may want you to disappear before you can explain why you had it. The room became quiet. Annie thought about Calvin in the warehouse, the way he did not care about the money, the way Richard looked afraid. She finally understood. The danger was never just being accused. The danger was becoming unnecessary. What happens to Jonathan, she asked. Agent Mitchell hesitated. He is being interviewed at his residence. Is he under arrest? Not currently. Not currently? That can change. Annie looked away. She did not know what she felt. Anger, pity, confusion. Maybe all of them. David noticed. You're worried about him. No. The answer came too quickly. David did not challenge it. Annie sighed. I don't know what I think about him. That's more honest. He lied by omission. Yes. He trusted me because I was the only person who returned his money instead of taking it. Yes. But he still let me walk into this. David looked at her carefully. Would you have gone if he had told you everything differently? Annie did not answer, because she knew the truth. Maybe she would not have. Maybe she needed to believe she was making the choice herself. A federal agent entered the room. Agent Mitchell. She turned. We received a new development. What? The agent handed her a printed document. She read it. Her expression changed. What is it? David asked. Agent Mitchell looked up. The company filed an emergency claim. Rachel frowned. Against who? Agent Mitchell looked at Annie. They are claiming the payroll reserve was illegally removed from company property. Anya started. They're saying the money belongs to them? Yes, but it was for workers. That is what we need to prove. Rachel shook her head. Richard is trying to turn unpaid wages into stolen assets. David took the document. This is exactly what he wanted. Annie looked at him. What? A legal battle over ownership. While everyone argues about the money, nobody asks why employees weren't paid. The room fell silent. Then Annie remembered something. The folder. David looked at her. What about it? Jonathan said the documents showed the wages. But if Richard changed the records, then we need the original payroll system. Rachel immediately responded. I know where it is. Everyone looked at her. Where? The old accounting server. Does it still exist? Yes. Richard moved everything downtown, but he never destroyed the old system. Why not? Rachel gave a small shrug. Because people who think they've won rarely clean up after themselves. Agent Mitchell looked at her. Can you access it? Maybe. That means? It means I can try. Annie looked between them. And if we find proof? David answered. Then the story changes. From what? He looked at the headline still displayed on the tablet. From a maid stealing money. He paused. To the woman who carried evidence nobody wanted found. For the first time that night, Annie felt something other than fear. Not confidence. Not safety. A purpose. But before she could respond, another phone rang. This time it was Agent Mitchell's. She answered. Yes? Her face changed almost immediately. Where? Pause. Keep him there. She ended the call. David stood. What happened? Agent Mitchell looked at Annie. Jonathan Whitmore has been arrested. Annie froze. For what? Obstruction of justice. That doesn't make sense. Agent Mitchell looked down at the document in her hand. They found evidence that someone inside Whitmore Industries deleted financial records. Rachel's face went pale. And they think Jonathan did it. They think he had access. Annie looked toward the window. Outside, morning had finally arrived. The night was over, but the real fight had just begun. Annie stood frozen after hearing the words. Jonathan Whitmore has been arrested. The room felt smaller. For what? She asked again. Agent Mitchell looked at the document. Obstruction of justice. Rachel shook her head immediately. That doesn't fit. Agent Mitchell looked at her. Explain. If Jonathan wanted to hide something, he wouldn't have handed the money to Annie. He would have destroyed the records and protected himself. That is what we are trying to determine. Annie looked at the agent. What evidence did they find? Deleted financial files. Deleted by him? We don't know yet. David stepped forward. Who reported the deletion? Agent Mitchell looked at him. The company's internal security team. Everyone went quiet. Rachel let out a short breath. Calvin. Nobody needed to say more. The same man who controlled the cameras. The same man who knew when the agents arrived. The same man who chased Annie before anyone officially knew she had the money. Annie looked at the table. So he created the story before anyone could prove otherwise. David nodded. That is what it looks like. But looks are not evidence. No. She looked at him. You sound like Agent Mitchell. Because she is right. Annie frowned. You're telling me to trust the system now? No, David replied. I'm telling you to understand the difference between suspicion and proof. She was silent. The difference was exactly what had put people like Maria in difficult situations for weeks. Everyone needed proof before acting, but someone always had to suffer while waiting for it. Agent Mitchell gathered the documents. We need to move quickly. If Richard's team controls the narrative, they can make Jonathan look like the person responsible for everything. Rachel looked at her. And what about Richard? We are investigating him. Investigating? Rachel's voice became sharper. He created fake vendors, redirected company money, and manipulated payroll records. And we need evidence that connects him directly. Rachel looked away. Annie noticed the frustration on her face. She understood it. People who committed wrongs often had time to build walls. The people hurt by those wrongs usually had to wait outside those walls until someone found a door. David picked up his coat. Rachel, you said the old accounting server still exists. Yes. Where? Whitmore Industries' original warehouse office. The same place? No, different location. The company moved 5 years ago. But the old building still stores archived equipment. Agent Mitchell looked at both of them. If that server contains original payroll records, it could change everything. Annie looked at her. Then, why are we still standing here? Agent Mitchell studied her. Because you are not an investigator. Annie nodded. I know. You could be considered a witness. I know that too. Then why do you want to go? Annie thought about the answer. Because she was tired of watching people decide what happened without asking the people who were there. Because Maria's unpaid wages were not a number. Because Earl's wife's medicine was not an accounting problem. Because somewhere along the way, everyone had forgotten there were human beings behind the paperwork. Because I was there when the story started changing. Nobody spoke. Then Agent Mitchell said, Fine. You come with us as a witness. You do not touch anything. You do not remove anything. You do not confront anyone. Annie nodded. Agreed. The drive to the old warehouse took nearly 40 minutes. The city was awake now. People were heading to work. Stores were opening. Children were being dropped off at schools. The world looked normal. Annie found that strange. Her entire life had changed in one night. Yet everyone else continued their morning routine. When they arrived, the building looked abandoned. The faded Whitmore Industries sign still hung above the entrance, though half the letters had fallen away. Rachel unlocked the side door. I haven't been here since I was fired. Annie looked at her. You were fired 3 weeks ago, but you still kept the access key? Rachel gave a small smile. I was an accountant. We keep everything. Inside, dust-covered old desks and empty shelves, boxes filled with paperwork from years before. David looked around. This place holds the company's history. Rachel nodded. And sometimes history is the thing people want hidden most. They reached a small room in the back. An old computer server sat inside a locked cabinet. Rachel stared at it. That's it. Agent Mitchell approached. Can you access it? Rachel took a breath. I can try. She connected the equipment. The machine hummed. Everyone waited. A login screen appeared. Rachel typed. Denied. She tried again. Denied. Her face tightened. They changed the password. David looked at her. Can you bypass it? Maybe. How long? I don't know. Annie looked around the room. Something felt wrong. Too quiet. She walked toward the door. Wait. Everyone turned. What? David asked. Annie looked at the floor. There were fresh footprints in the dust. Rachel's face changed. No. Agent Mitchell immediately reached for her radio. Everyone stay back. Annie pointed. Someone was here recently. A sound came from the hallway. A door closing. Then another. They were not alone. Agent Mitchell moved everyone away from the server room. Whoever is inside, show yourself. No answer. Then a voice came from the dark hallway. You really should have stopped looking. Annie recognized it. Calvin Ross. He stepped into view, but this time, he was not chasing her. He was holding a folder, and he looked afraid. I'm not here to take the money, Calvin said. David frowned. Then why are you here? Calvin looked at the old server. Because the records inside that machine will destroy more than Richard. Annie stared at him. What are you saying? Calvin looked directly at her. I'm saying Jonathan Whitmore was not the only Whitmore who knew what was happening. A silence filled the room. Agent Mitchell raised her weapon slightly. Explain. Calvin swallowed. The payroll fraud started before Richard took control. Annie felt her chest tighten. By who? Calvin looked at the folder in his hand. Then at Annie. By the person who taught Richard how to do it. Nobody moved. Who? Calvin's answer came quietly. Jonathan Whitmore. Nobody spoke. The old warehouse seemed to become even quieter after Calvin's words. Jonathan Whitmore. Annie stared at him. The man who had begged her to take the suitcase. The man who had admitted trusting the wrong person. The man she had started to believe might have been trying to fix something he failed to stop. Now his own security director was saying he was part of it. Agent Mitchell kept her eyes on Calvin. Choose your next words carefully. Calvin nodded. I know, because accusing someone without evidence is not a confession. It's a story. I have evidence. He lifted the folder in his hand. David stepped forward. What is in there? Copies of old internal reports, emails, payment approvals. From when? 7 years ago. Rachel looked confused. 7 years? Calvin nodded. That's when the first fake vendors appeared. Annie looked at him. You said Richard started this. He expanded it. That's not the same thing. No. Calvin looked down, and that's why I stayed quiet. The admission changed the room. Annie noticed, not because it surprised her, because he finally sounded like someone who knew he had done something wrong. You knew? Calvin looked at her. I suspected. You were head of security. Yes. You watched the company. You watched the employees. You watched people lose their jobs. His jaw tightened. I know. And you did nothing? The question hung between them. Calvin did not defend himself. That made Annie angrier. I thought powerful people were supposed to stop things like this. Calvin looked away. Sometimes powerful people are the reason those things continue. Agent Mitchell stepped closer. Why come forward now? Calvin hesitated. Then he answered, because Richard was supposed to control the damage. David frowned. What does that mean? It means the plan was never to steal from the company and leave evidence behind. Richard was supposed to blame the accounting department, remove a few executives, and make the losses look like fraud committed by lower-level employees. Rachel's face changed. He was going to blame us. Yes. Annie looked at Calvin. And Jonathan? Calvin did not answer immediately. That silence bothered her more than anything else. Finally, he said, Jonathan knew some numbers did not make sense. The room became still. But he believed fixing the company quietly was better than exposing his own family. Annie felt something sink inside her, so he covered it up. He delayed. That is a nicer word. Calvin accepted that. Yes. David looked at Annie. She looked away. The image of Jonathan in the library came back. His tired face, his confession, his words about believing reports instead of people. She had thought his mistake was trusting Richard. Now she wondered if his mistake was protecting him. Agent Mitchell extended her hand. Give me the folder. Calvin hesitated. Once I give you this, I lose any protection I have. You may already have lost it. He looked toward the old server, then handed it over. Agent Mitchell opened it carefully. Rachel moved closer. Those are copies of transaction approvals. David scanned the first page. His expression changed. Jonathan signed these. Annie looked at him. Does that mean Calvin is telling the truth? David studied the documents. It means Jonathan approved these transactions. That is not the same thing. No. Again, that word. Not the same. The difference between suspicion and proof. The difference between guilt and responsibility. The difference between a mistake and a crime. Annie looked at Calvin. Why did you help him? Calvin seemed confused. Who? Jonathan. I didn't. You protected him. Calvin looked down. Because I thought he was trying to fix it. And now? Now I think he waited too long. Nobody spoke. A notification sounded from the old computer. Rachel turned. Wait. Everyone looked toward the server. The screen changed. A folder appeared. Someone accessed the system remotely. Agent Mitchell immediately moved closer. Can you identify who? Rachel typed quickly. Her fingers moved faster. Then she stopped. What? Rachel stared at the screen. The access code. Whose is it? David asked. Rachel swallowed. Jonathan Whitmore's. Annie felt the room shift again. No. Rachel looked at her. I'm sorry. That doesn't prove he did anything. No, David said. But it proves someone used his credentials. Agent Mitchell looked at Calvin. Who else had access? Calvin answered quietly. Richard. Anyone else? Calvin hesitated. Then, me. Everyone looked at him. I had emergency access. Annie stepped back slightly. So any one of you could have done this? Yes. The honesty was almost painful. Agent Mitchell looked at the server. We need to secure this immediately. Before anyone could move, the lights went out. The warehouse fell into darkness. Someone had cut the power. Rachel whispered, They know we're here. A door slammed somewhere in the building. Agent Mitchell drew her weapon. Stay together. Annie felt her phone vibrate. One new message. No number. Only 3 words. Ask Jonathan why. She stared at the screen. Then she realized something. Whoever sent the message knew exactly what they were doing. They did not want her to believe Calvin. They did not want her to believe Jonathan. They wanted her to keep doubting, because as long as everyone questioned everyone else, the truth remained buried. The warehouse went completely dark. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The silence after the power cut felt heavier than the darkness itself. Agent Mitchell spoke first. Everyone stay where you are. Her voice remained calm, but Annie heard the change in it. This was no longer an investigation. This was a threat. Rachel whispered. The backup generator should have started. Calvin answered quietly, unless someone disabled it. David looked toward the hallway. How many entrances? 3, Calvin replied. Annie noticed everyone looked at him. Even after everything he had admitted, he was still the person who knew the building best. Agent Mitchell turned on her flashlight. Then you're going to guide us. Calvin nodded. Nobody trusted him, but everyone needed him. That was the kind of situation that created dangerous alliances. They moved toward the server room. Rachel stayed close to the equipment. I need 5 minutes. You don't have 5 minutes, Agent Mitchell said. I need the files copied before anyone touches this system. Annie looked at the dark hallway. How long before whoever did this gets here? Calvin listened. Then he answered, not long. A noise came from the other side of the building. A door opening, then footsteps. Slow, controlled. Whoever was inside was not searching. They already knew where they were going. Calvin moved toward a side entrance. I'll check. Agent Mitchell stopped him. You're not going alone. I know this building. You're also the person who may have helped create this situation. Calvin looked at her. That's fair. The answer surprised Annie. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply accepted it. Agent Mitchell followed him. David stayed with Annie and Rachel. Annie looked at the server. Can you find out who accessed it? Rachel continued typing. Maybe. Maybe? I'm an accountant, not a hacker. You seem to know a lot for someone who isn't. Rachel gave a small smile. People underestimate accountants. Annie almost smiled back. Almost. Then Rachel stopped. What? Rachel stared at the screen. I found something. David stepped closer. What? The remote access was not from tonight. Annie looked at her. What do you mean? The account was used 3 days ago. By Jonathan? Rachel shook her head. No. Then who? Rachel turned the screen. A name appeared. Richard Whitmore. Nobody spoke. Anya started. So Richard used Jonathan's credentials. Yes. Then why did the system show Jonathan? Because Richard wanted it to. David leaned closer. This is the proof we need. Rachel shook her head. Not yet. Why? Because this only proves Richard accessed the system using Jonathan's account. We still need to prove he created the fraud. Annie looked at the screen. How much proof do people need before they believe what happened? David answered quietly. Enough to survive a courtroom. Before she could respond, a loud crash came from the hallway. Everyone froze. Agent Mitchell's voice came through the darkness. Back room. Now. Calvin appeared first. Behind him was a man Annie did not recognize. A warehouse employee. Middle-aged. His hands were raised. Wait, Calvin said. He's not with them. Agent Mitchell entered behind him. He was hiding. The man looked terrified. Rachel recognized him. Sam? The man looked at her. Rachel. Annie looked between them. Who is he? Rachel answered. He worked in shipping. Sam looked at Annie. You have the money? Annie immediately became defensive. Why? Because they're coming after everyone connected to it. Who? Sam looked toward the door. Richard. Calvin stepped forward. Explain. Sam swallowed. I worked nights at the warehouse. I saw the shipments, the fake vendors, the empty deliveries. Why didn't you report it? Rachel asked. Sam looked down. Because the last person who asked questions disappeared. Annie's expression changed. What do you mean disappeared? Transferred, fired, moved away. Everyone had a reason. The answer was familiar. Fear. Not one big act. 100 small warnings telling people to stay quiet. Sam looked at the server. Richard knows about this room. How? Agent Mitchell asked. He had someone inside. Who? Sam hesitated, then looked at Calvin. The room became tense. Calvin stared back. What? Sam shook his head. I don't know the name. Everyone relaxed slightly. He only said the person worked close to Jonathan. Annie thought about the library, the staff, the security system, the people who had access. Then her phone vibrated again. The same unknown number. This time there was a photo. Annie opened it. Her face changed. What is it? David asked. She handed him the phone. The picture showed Jonathan, sitting alone in an interrogation room. The message underneath was simple. Your hero is talking. Anya started. What does that mean? Calvin looked at the screen. He's giving them a statement. David frowned. Against who? The phone vibrated again. Another message appeared. This time with a short video. Annie pressed play. Jonathan's voice filled the dark room. I approved the transactions. Everyone froze. The video ended. Annie looked at the others. For the first time since the night began, she felt something she had tried not to feel. Betrayal. Because if Jonathan was telling the truth, he had been hiding something. And if the video was manipulated, someone had just found the perfect way to destroy the only person she thought she could trust. Rachel looked at her. Annie. She did not answer. She looked at the screen again. The question was no longer who was lying. The question was whether the truth had already been changed before anyone could reach it. The video ended. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was the hum of the server beginning to restart after the power returned. Annie stared at the phone screen. Jonathan's voice kept repeating in her mind. I approved the transactions. Those words sounded simple. Too simple. David took the phone from her hand and watched the video again. Then again. Finally, he lowered it. This is edited. Annie looked at him. You're sure? Yes. How? Because Jonathan's statement ends too cleanly. Rachel frowned. What does that mean? A real interrogation doesn't end with one perfect sentence. They ask follow-up questions. They challenge the person. This clip was cut to create a specific impression. Annie looked at the screen. Someone wanted people to believe he admitted everything. Yes. Calvin remained silent. Annie noticed. You don't seem surprised. He looked at her. I'm not. Why? Because Richard has used edited information before. The room became tense again. Rachel turned toward him. You knew? I suspected. That word again. Calvin looked down. I know. Annie stepped closer. No, you don't get to say you suspected and walk away. People lost money. People lost jobs. You had access to everything. Calvin accepted the anger. You're right. The response stopped her for a moment. She expected excuses. There were none. That somehow made it harder. Agent Mitchell checked her phone. We need to leave. David looked at her. Why? Because this location is compromised. She looked at Calvin. And now we know someone is actively manipulating the investigation. Rachel quickly removed the drive from the server. I have the files. Are they complete? Enough to prove Richard accessed the system. Not enough to prove everything. Annie looked at her. What about Jonathan? Rachel hesitated. We need to know why he approved those transactions. The question stayed in the air, because everyone knew what it meant. If Jonathan had approved the payments, then his story was not as simple as being betrayed by his brother. They left the warehouse through the back entrance. The morning had become brighter, but Annie felt like she was still trapped in the same night. Outside, Agent Mitchell stopped beside the vehicles. Annie, you need to understand something. What? People who control information rarely need to control the truth. Annie looked at her. They just need to control when people hear it. The sentence stayed with her, because that was exactly what had happened. A headline before evidence. A video before an explanation. A story before the truth. On the way to the federal office, Annie sat quietly in the back seat. She watched Charlotte pass by through the window. People walked into coffee shops. Workers entered buildings. Cars moved through intersections. Everyone was continuing their lives. She wondered how many people had no idea that their own problems were hidden behind paperwork, signatures, and meetings they would never attend. When they arrived, Jonathan was already there. Not in a holding cell. Not behind glass. Sitting in an interview room with his lawyer. Annie stopped when she saw him. He looked older than he had the night before. His eyes found hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jonathan stood. Annie. She did not move closer. You approved the transactions. His expression changed. I know what you saw. Did you? I did. Then explain. His lawyer stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore should not answer questions without. Jonathan raised his hand. No. The lawyer stopped. Jonathan looked at Annie. I owe her the truth. Annie crossed her arms. Then tell me. Jonathan sat back down. 7 years ago, Whitmore Industries was nearly bankrupt. David looked at him. You never mentioned that. Because I was ashamed. Nobody interrupted. Richard came to me with a plan. He said we could restructure certain contracts, move expenses temporarily, and recover after the next quarter. And you agreed, Annie said. Yes. Knowing it was wrong? Jonathan looked at the table. At the beginning, I convinced myself it was legal. And later? Later I realized it was not. The room was quiet. Why didn't you stop it? Jonathan looked at her. Because by then, stopping it would have exposed thousands of employees, investors, and families to the collapse of the company. Annie's expression hardened. So, you protected the company. I thought I was protecting people, but you protected yourself too. Jonathan did not deny it. Yes, that honesty hurt more than an excuse would have. Annie looked away. All this time I thought you were different. I know. No, I don't think you do. Jonathan lowered his eyes. You saw me as someone who finally chose the right thing. Yes, And I did choose the right thing. After years of choosing silence. The words landed. Jonathan nodded slowly. You're right. David looked at Annie. She saw the conflict on his face. The same conflict she felt. Because Jonathan was not innocent. But he also was not the monster the headline wanted him to be. Agent Mitchell entered the room. We have a new development. Everyone turned. She placed a file on the table. Richard Whitmore is attempting to leave the country. Rachel looked shocked. Can he? Not if we move quickly. Jonathan looked up. Where is he going? Agent Mitchell opened the file. Switzerland. Silence. Then Annie noticed something. A small detail. A date on one of the documents. She reached for the file. Wait. Agent Mitchell looked at her. What? Annie pointed. This transaction. Everyone looked down. The money moved 7 years ago. Yes. But the employee accounts were created after that. David frowned. What are you saying? Annie looked at the documents. I'm saying Richard didn't create the system. She looked at Jonathan. He inherited it. The room went silent. Because that meant one thing. The person who started everything was still hidden. And they had been looking at the wrong enemy the entire time. The room remained silent after Annie's words. He inherited it. Nobody moved. Because everyone understood what that meant. For hours they had been searching for the person who created the fraud. They had followed Richard's actions, Jonathan's signatures, and the missing payroll funds. But Annie had noticed something everyone else overlooked. The timeline. Agent Mitchell took the document from her. Show me. Annie pointed at the dates. This transaction happened 7 years ago, but the employee accounts connected to the fake vendors were created later. David leaned closer. She's right. Rachel checked the records. The accounts were opened 5 years ago. Jonathan looked confused. Richard joined the financial restructuring team 5 years ago. Annie looked at him. So before Richard expanded it, someone had already built the system. Jonathan's face changed. A memory had returned. Wait. Everyone looked at him. 7 years ago, the person managing company restructuring was not Richard. Who was it? Agent Mitchell asked. Jonathan was quiet. Then he answered, my former chief financial officer. David frowned. Name? Thomas Grayson. Rachel immediately searched the records. Her expression changed. Thomas Grayson retired 6 years ago. Retired? Annie asked. Rachel looked up. That's what the company reported. But? Rachel continued scrolling. But his consulting company still received payments from Whitmore Industries. The room became tense. Agent Mitchell looked at Jonathan. You knew this? No. You signed the payments? Jonathan looked at the documents. I signed hundreds of financial approvals every month. Richard filtered everything through his department. David looked at him. And you never questioned it? Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. I trusted my brother. Annie looked away. That sentence again. The same mistake. Trusting the wrong person. But now she understood something. Jonathan's weakness was not greed. It was believing that loyalty meant protecting people even when they hurt others. Agent Mitchell stood. We need to find Thomas Grayson. Rachel shook her head. That won't be easy. Why? Because people like Thomas don't disappear. They become respectable. She opened another file. Board positions, private investments, charity foundations. Annie looked at the screen. A photograph appeared. An older man in a suit, smiling beside politicians and community leaders. People still trust him. Rachel nodded. That's how people like him survive. David looked at Annie. You noticed the timeline because you weren't looking at money. What was I looking at? People. She looked down. I was looking at names. That's the same thing. Before Annie could answer, Agent Mitchell's phone rang. She stepped aside. Everyone waited. After 30 seconds, her expression changed. What happened? David asked. She ended the call. Richard was detained at the airport. Rachel exhaled. Good. Agent Mitchell shook her head. Not exactly. What? He wasn't trying to escape. Everyone looked at her. He was trying to contact someone. Who? Agent Mitchell opened her notebook. Thomas Grayson. The room went quiet. Annie looked at Jonathan. He knew. Jonathan's face became pale. Richard knew who was behind it. And he was going to tell someone. Or he was going to make a deal, David added. Agent Mitchell nodded. Either way, we need Richard before someone changes his mind. A few hours later, Richard Whitmore sat across from them. The difference between him and Jonathan was immediate. Jonathan looked like a man carrying regret. Richard looked like a man calculating his options. He glanced at Annie. So you're the maid. The room became cold. Agent Mitchell noticed. Mr. Whitmore. What? You are speaking to a witness. Richard leaned back. I'm simply saying she's the reason we're all sitting here. Annie looked at him. No, I'm the reason people finally stopped ignoring it. A small smile appeared on Richard's face. You really believe that? Yes. That's the problem with people who have never had power. Agent Mitchell interrupted. Mr. Whitmore, we are not here to discuss philosophy. Then ask your questions. David placed documents on the table. Thomas Grayson. Richard's expression changed. Only slightly. But Annie noticed. You know him. Richard said nothing. That means you know exactly what happened. Richard looked at Jonathan. Did he tell you? Jonathan answered. No. Richard laughed quietly. That's the most surprising thing. Annie frowned. What do you mean? Richard looked at her. My brother spent years pretending he didn't know. Jonathan's face tightened. Richard. No. You want honesty now? Fine. Richard leaned forward. Thomas created the system. He taught me how it worked. He told me every company needed someone willing to make difficult decisions. And you believed him, Annie said. I believed him because he was right about one thing. What? Richard looked at Jonathan. People with money don't lose because they make mistakes. He paused. They lose because someone eventually decides the rules apply to them too. Nobody spoke. Agent Mitchell collected her papers. Where is Thomas Grayson? Richard looked at her. You think I'm going to help you? Annie watched him. You're scared of him. Richard's expression hardened. I'm not scared. You are. How do you know? Because you were willing to destroy your brother, your company, and your reputation. She leaned slightly forward. But you still won't say his name without looking around first. The room became silent. For the first time, Richard looked uncertain. Then he finally spoke. He keeps records. Where? Richard looked at Annie. Because of people like me. He always expected someone to betray him. And? He hid everything where nobody would look. Where? Richard swallowed. In the Whitmore Family Foundation. Jonathan froze. My mother's foundation? Richard nodded. The one you thought represented everything good about this family. Annie felt the weight of the words. The place built to show generosity. The place everyone trusted. The perfect hiding place. Agent Mitchell stood immediately. We go now. As everyone moved, Annie stayed still for a moment. She looked at Jonathan. Your family built a reputation around helping people. Jonathan lowered his eyes. And someone used that reputation to hide from them. Annie nodded. For the first time, she saw the whole picture. The money was never just stolen. The truth was, the Whitmore Family Foundation stood on a quiet street in Charlotte, surrounded by old trees and carefully maintained gardens. For decades, it had been the symbol of everything the Whitmore name wanted people to believe. Scholarships, community programs, donations to hospitals, support for families in need, the kind of place where people took photographs and shook hands, the kind of place nobody expected to hide a crime. Annie looked at the building through the car window. It doesn't look like a place where someone hides anything. David sat beside her. That's usually why people choose places like this. Agent Mitchell organized the team before they entered. Everyone stays together. We don't know what Grayson left behind. Jonathan stood near the entrance. He had not spoken much since Richard revealed the truth. Annie noticed. You knew him. Jonathan looked at her. Thomas? Yes. For 15 years. And you trusted him? Jonathan nodded. He helped build the company. And then he helped destroy it. Jonathan looked down. I should have seen it. Annie studied him. You're going to say you trusted him again? He was silent. That was his answer. They entered the foundation building. The receptionist recognized Jonathan immediately. Mr. Whitmore? He nodded. We need access to the financial archives. The woman looked confused. The archives? Yes. She hesitated. Mr. Grayson handled those records before he left. Everyone stopped. David looked at Agent Mitchell. That's convenient. The receptionist looked nervous. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Agent Mitchell showed her badge. We need the records immediately. The woman stepped aside. The archive room was located in the basement. Rows of boxes filled the shelves. Donor files, financial reports, old photographs, a history of the Whitmore family. Rachel walked along the shelves. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing. Annie looked at her. Why? He buried financial records inside charitable records. Anyone searching for fraud would look at company accounts. They wouldn't look at donations. Agent Mitchell opened a cabinet. Find something. Inside were several folders. David took the first one. Foundation transfers. Rachel opened another. Her face changed. What? She handed it to Agent Mitchell. The documents showed money moving from company accounts into foundation accounts, then into private investment companies. Annie looked closer. Those names. David followed her eyes. Fake vendors. Rachel nodded. Same companies. Jonathan stepped forward. And my signature? Agent Mitchell looked through the pages. No. Everyone looked surprised. What? Jonathan asked. There are approvals, but not your signatures. David examined the documents. They used authorization codes. Jonathan looked confused. Those codes were only available to senior executives. Rachel turned slowly. Who had access? Jonathan looked at her. Richard. And? A long silence. Then Jonathan answered. Tomas. Annie watched his face. This was the first time she saw something other than guilt. Shock. Because Jonathan had finally reached the part of the truth he had been avoiding. He had not simply trusted one person. He had trusted a system built by several people. A noise came from the hallway. Everyone turned. A man stood at the entrance. Older. Gray hair. Expensive suit. Calm expression. Thomas Grayson. Nobody spoke. He looked at Jonathan first. I wondered how long it would take. Agent Mitchell stepped forward. Thomas Grayson, you are under investigation for financial crimes involving Whitmore Industries. Thomas smiled slightly. Investigation? He looked around. You still believe this is about money? Annie stepped forward. Isn't it? Thomas looked at her. You must be Annie. She did not react. You know my name. I know everything about the people involved. That sounds like a threat. It's a fact. Agent Mitchell moved closer. Where are the remaining records? Thomas smiled. Why would I tell you? Because your freedom depends on cooperation. No. He looked at Jonathan. My freedom depends on whether people finally understand the truth. Jonathan's expression hardened. You used my name. Thomas nodded. Yes. You destroyed employees' lives. I managed risk. Annie's face changed. Risk? Thomas looked at her. Every successful company makes difficult choices. No. Her voice remained calm. They make choices. Then they decide who has to pay for them. Thomas studied her. You really believe that? Yes. Why? Because I met the people who paid. For the first time, Thomas had no immediate response. Annie continued. Maria, Earl Bell, the warehouse workers, they were not numbers. Thomas looked away. People like you always think emotions are evidence. No, Annie said. People like you think numbers erase people. The room went quiet. Agent Mitchell received a message. She checked her phone, then looked up. We have confirmation. Everyone waited. The original servers have been recovered. The deleted files match the records found here. David exhaled. Enough? Agent Mitchell nodded. Enough. Thomas's expression finally changed. Not fear. Recognition. He understood the game was over. Later that afternoon, the official statement was released. The investigation showed that Thomas Grayson and Richard Whitmore had created a financial system designed to hide company losses and redirect funds. Richard cooperated after evidence was presented. Thomas faced multiple federal charges. Jonathan Whitmore was not cleared of every mistake. He admitted publicly that he had ignored warning signs and allowed loyalty to his family to influence his decisions. But he also testified against the people who used his name. The workers received the unpaid wages through a court-supervised process. Maria Delgado cried when she received her payment. Not because of the money, because someone finally admitted she had been right. Several weeks later, Annie returned to Whitmore House. Not as a maid, as a witness to a company rebuilding itself. Jonathan stood in the library where everything had started. You never had to come back here. I know. Then why did you? Annie looked around the room. Because this was the place where you asked me to trust you. Jonathan nodded. And now? She looked at him. Now I believe trust is something people earn every day. A small smile appeared on his face. That sounds like something your grandmother would say. She would. They stood quietly for a moment. Outside, employees walked through the garden for a company meeting. People who had once been invisible were now being asked their opinions. Annie kept the old blue notebook in her pocket, the same notebook where she had written the names of people nobody seemed to notice. Jonathan looked at it. You still carry that? Yes. Why? Annie closed it. Because someone should always remember the names behind the numbers. And that was the lesson everyone at Whitmore Industries finally learned. Money could be recovered, companies could be rebuilt, reputations could change, but the hardest thing to restore was trust. And trust was never built by what people did when everyone was watching. It was built by what they chose to do when they believed nobody important would ever know. This story reminds us that honesty, courage, and justice often begin with ordinary people who refuse to stay silent. Annie had little power, but she chose to protect the workers whose labor had been ignored and whose wages had been stolen. Her actions show that trust must be earned, loyalty should never excuse wrongdoing, and true justice is not about protecting wealth or reputation, it is about standing up for people who have been treated unfairly, even when doing so comes at a personal cost. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.